Morning, everyone. Time now is 11:21. If you happen to be watching this afterwards, from this live broadcast, just be aware that we recorded this at 11:21 this morning. So, good morning to everybody in the Midlands. Well, quite a big story that we've had. Earlier this morning, the National Hurricane Center indicated that Irma became a Category 5. Well, the latest update from the National Hurricane Center, Irma is still a Category 5 hurricane, a very strong and ferocious hurricane. Currently, right now, the winds are at, get a load of this, 180. Yeah, I just said that. 180 mile an hour sustained winds. The wind gusts up to 220 miles an hour. Now, it is moving west now, straight west, at about 14 miles an hour. This is continually ramped up. And one main reason why is that it's in the middle of nowhere right now. It's in the eastern Atlantic, east central Atlantic, and there's no landmass anywhere around it, at least right now. Over the last 2 days, that's why it's gotten enough to really fuel up and intensify. The hurricane eye wall right now is about 30 miles wide. Just to give you a comparison of Hurricane Harvey, that was a Category 4 hurricane that we dealt with 2 weeks ago out in Texas. That was a Category 4 hurricane, and the eye wall was about 10 miles in diameter. This one's 30, and you can see, as an atmospheric scientist, this is a very impressive. It is very symmetrically round with a very, very pronounced eye wall. Now, currently right now, there are already hurricane warnings still in effect for, this is the British Virgin Islands, this is the U.S. Virgin Islands, and then the island of Puerto Rico. Hurricane warnings are in effect right now and will continue. The track of the hurricane has changed just a little bit. More so, the intensity has changed. So as you go throughout this 5-day evolution, Wednesday morning at 8 a.m., it is expected to be still Category 5 with 175 mile an hour winds somewhere in the British Virgin Islands. By Thursday morning, it'll be passing just over, so Wednesday night into Thursday morning, passing over, if not north of Puerto Rico, and then into the areas of Hispaniola. The east side of Hispaniola is Dominican Republic. The west side is Haiti. Hurricane watch is already in effect for the entire northern coastline of Hispaniola. New hurricane watches have already been in effect now for the eastern islands of the Bahamas, of the Greater Antilles Islands, and then that'll be by Friday morning at 8 a.m. By Saturday morning at 8 a.m., it's going to be positioned either the north shore of Cuba or the south shore of central Cuba. The northern end extends all the way up to Nassau and Freeport, the Bahamas. That's Saturday morning. By Sunday morning, the position will be as a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 145 miles an hour. Very large cone of uncertainty. It can be anywhere from the western tip of the peninsula of Cuba to the south shores, along the Florida Keys, possibly into the areas around Miami-Dade County, Florida, and then even as north as the Bahamas. This outer band, this extreme outer band of the 5-day trajectory of the cone of uncertainty, pretty much, and if you know what Florida, you know Florida, it's pretty much right along from the west coast to east coast of Alligator Alley and everything south of that. So St. Pete, Fort Myers, Miami, and then into areas around Daytona Beach, everything south of that. It just covers right over Lake Okeechobee in Florida, so that would be right around the Orlando metro area. This is the current 5-day track. The reason why we've been watching this so intently is that this is a very, very well-wrapped hurricane. The wind's at 180 miles an hour. As we take it day by day over the evolution of this hurricane, you could see where the cone of uncertainty takes it either just over the British Virgin Islands by Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, it'll just be approaching San Juan, Puerto Rico. But keep in mind that this cone of uncertainty does cover right over the Puerto Rican, the island of Puerto Rico. Still a very intense hurricane, projected anywhere from 160 to 170 mile an hour winds as it makes its way by Wednesday evening over Puerto Rico. By Thursday morning, it's still a very strong Category 5 hurricane with winds at 160 miles an hour, potentially making landfall over the north shore of the Dominican Republic. By Friday morning, it's going to be anywhere from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, on the east side of Cuba, to as far up as into the areas of the southern Caribbean. Still 155 mile an hour wind, so that's a Category 4. And then moving into the areas around anywhere from north of Nassau all the way into the north shore of central Cuba to even the south shore of central Cuba. And then by Sunday, moving into areas anywhere from Tampa, St. Pete, Fort Myers, Miami, Key West, Florida, the Keys of Florida, and then to the east side where you can talk about Miami all the way up to possibly Orlando. So this is the reason why we're watching this. That's only a 5-day track. Okay, what is it for the Midlands? Here's the uncertainty. A lot of the 6 and 7 day models definitely have it turning further north once it crosses anywhere around the Florida Keys. The biggest question is, which way will it go? If it turns north and heads past the Keys, it very likely is going to stay on the west coast of Florida. So a direct impact for areas from St. Petersburg, Fort Myers, Tampa, Panama City, and Tallahassee. If it makes it along the east coast, there's a possibility of it making a landfall in the city of Miami, but then continuing right along the coastline. So you're talking about Miami, Jupiter, Florida, Daytona Beach, Jacksonville, and possibly staying in open waters and heading towards the low country of South Carolina. There's a lot of uncertainty. I just wanted to give you an idea on the 6 and 7 day track of where this potentially could be. So the impacts we're looking at for South Carolina, if it makes a west coast line over the 6th and 7th day, which would be Monday and Tuesday, it would be coming in the areas around, say, Macon and Albany, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, possibly into the upstate. Whereas on the East Coast, it'll be coming right up the line to, say, St. Mary's and Brunswick, Georgia, off the coastline, Tybee Island, Edisto Beach, the Low Country, and then into the Midlands. There's absolutely no uncertainty of which one it will be. But the bottom line is this. By Monday morning, we'll start getting rain. It'll continue of whatever we may be getting as late as Tuesday evening into Wednesday, covering pretty much all the Midlands. So that is the information that we have right now. This 5-day track of all the spaghetti models ends right here from Miami, Florida to Key West and Havana, Cuba. All of this on a 6 and 7 day track. This is a possibility, but there is absolutely, positively no way to guarantee which way it's going to go, because we have to wait until it makes this turn over in the areas from the Florida Straits and the Florida Keys and potentially north of Havana, Cuba to as far east as Nassau, the Bahamas. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but nevertheless, the bottom line is that this is a very powerful and very dangerous hurricane right now, with sustained winds at 180 miles an hour as a very, very strong Category 5 hurricane. Now keep in mind, a Category 5 hurricane on the Safford-Simpson scale, once it reaches winds of over 156 miles an hour, it is then a Category 5. There's no such thing as a Category 6. If the Category 5 hurricane winds start at 157 miles an hour, we're well past that at this point. The reason why we're showing you this on Facebook Live is that we want to make sure that you're informed. As a lot of people have been asking about this, this has been pretty much the talk of the country over the last 2 days and will be for several days. Why we're on Facebook Live? Because a lot of you are asking questions, so we want to make sure that we're answering your questions. And Tony, I'm pretty sure we've got a wealth of questions right now.
Well, some people are asking a little bit about the islands too. They say they have family down there, so what's the potential impact on some of these islands?
Yeah, and a lot of people, in fact, the question is, a lot of you have family who are in the islands right now and really want to know. So let me jump ahead to the other one that's a little bit closer so I can actually see the islands, as we go day by day. I had somebody who called me up and said, my son just got married. He's in Jamaica right now. And I told him, well, congratulations. Now you have a daughter-in-law, but they're in Jamaica. Okay, what I told them was that right now it doesn't look like an impact for Jamaica, but here is the potential impacts. By Wednesday, tomorrow morning, this is going to be affecting the British and U.S. Virgin Islands, as well as Puerto Rico. The cone of uncertainty does take it onshore, possibly, as well as right on the cuff of approaching Puerto Rico. So if you have anybody who's vacationing out there right now, one thing that they're definitely trying to find out right now is if they're being evacuated. So if you got anybody who's vacationing the British Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. Very likely they're already talking to the hotel or the cruise lines of when and where they're going to be evacuated to. Let's go out to the Dominican Republic. Here's the Dominican Republic, the capital city of Santiago. There is a hurricane watch in effect for the entire coastline, the northern coastline of the Dominican Republic and of Haiti as well. So this goes in by Thursday morning. It's still a very strong Category 5 hurricane with winds at 160 miles an hour. It also includes hurricane watches in effect for the southern islands of the Greater Antilles, because this Thursday morning, by Friday morning, it's going to be moving into the southern islands of the Greater Antilles. And if you have anybody who vacations or is in eastern Cuba, anywhere from Guantanamo Bay into the mountain region, by Friday morning to Friday midday, whether this makes actual landfall in Cuba or not, they're definitely going to be feeling the brunt of it. And I'll explain what we're going to be entailing of what all of these areas are going to be experiencing. So that's Friday morning at 8 o'clock. If they're anywhere from Nassau, Freeport, the Bahamas, all the way into central Cuba, even into the capital city of Havana. And then now we're talking about Key West, Key Largo, Bahia Honda Key, Miami, the entire Miami-Dade area. By Friday morning, this could be potentially as a Category 4 hurricane with wind speeds of 150 miles an hour. So that covers the Keys. And then when you get into the northern areas, so this would be Freeport, the Bahamas. Let's say they're vacationing in Disney World, or they're in Tampa St. Pete, Fort Myers, Florida, Miami, Daytona Beach. This puts it by Sunday morning after 8 a.m. for this entire area. So what could we be expecting from any and all of these areas? Well, number one, let me see if I can go back on this here. Number one, as this continues to move through, the biggest threat, especially over the next 48 hours, from the British Virgin Islands to Puerto Rico to Hispaniola, so Dominican Republic, and for Haiti, the biggest threat that they're going to be experiencing is hurricane force winds in excess of 160 to 170 mile an hour winds. That's going to be anywhere on the island, especially along the cone where it's possible landfall. There is going to be torrential rainfall. You're talking about 15, 20, 25 inches of rainfall within a very short period of time, anywhere from 18 to 24 hours. That is going to be the general theme when you get into the lower islands of the Greater Antilles and of the North Shore of Haiti. That's going to be the same thing for Newport, for Nassau, and Freeport in the Bahamas, especially if this starts tracking a little bit further north. So you're talking about 150 mile an hour sustained winds with this hurricane. You're talking about torrential rainfall that will be ongoing for at least 18 to 24 hours. And keep in mind that even if this track stays to fruition and it does not come towards Nassau, anything associated with hurricane that's on the northern end or eastern end is where the most destructive winds will be, let alone the very heavy rainfall. So even if this track takes it right along the Cuban northern coastline, areas of the Greater Antilles from Nassau and Freeport, the Bahamas, are going to feel the brunt of the wind and no doubt of the heavy rainfall. If you have anybody who is vacationing right now from, say, Key West to Key Largo, anywhere in the Keys, they're going to be experiencing anywhere up to possibly 145 mile an hour winds, and that'll be the entire Keys. Every single key may be affected by that, and no doubt very, very heavy rainfall. So that's the reason why we've been putting out this information and mentioning it now repeatedly, and we're going to be doing this for several days until it gets up to the Midlands. Tony?
Well, a lot of people are wanting to know, like, if it hit our state, what would be the intensity? But you might can speak to that.
Yeah. So a question is, if it makes it to the Midlands, what's going to be the intensity? It's very difficult to really pinpoint what it is, but from history, this is what may potentially happen. If it makes a northerly turn and it stays around the Florida Keys, it'll very likely stay on the west coast. If that's the case, again, the most intense part of a hurricane is going to be on the eastern and northern side. So as this transcends through Florida, again, it could be on the west coast or it could go right up the spine of Florida. It'll come up through Georgia, and then the main line affecting would be from the upstate and everything east. We're looking at very heavy rainfall. We're looking at very strong winds. We're looking at, if that is the case, as it comes up the west side, very likely we're looking at the distinct possibility of severe weather, severe thunderstorms and severe thunderstorm warnings. Now, if it goes through the Miami-Dade area and stays on the East Coast, regardless of whether it makes landfall along the East Coast of Florida or not, this track takes it right along the East Coast, and there's really not a lot of deviation. So let's just say this is the case, and this goes straight through into the low country. Well, we're very likely going to be looking at a very strong hurricane that'll make its way through. And all the conditions of a hurricane, we're talking about hurricane force winds, 85 to 95 miles an hour. We're talking about torrential rainfall. We're talking about severe thunderstorms associated with this. Is that going to happen? I can tell you with absolute certainty right now, we don't know. There's no way to gauge what effects this is going to have. The one thing that we do know, without a question of a doubt, sometime as early as Monday midday to as late as Tuesday evening, it'll start affecting not only the Midlands, but it'll be affecting South Carolina. What we're going to be expecting, we're really not sure yet, but no doubt there's going to be inclement weather from tropical characteristics that we'll be experiencing in the Midlands and pretty much all of South Carolina. And Tony?
I think maybe some people are going to like the timing again. What is kind of the timing of when we can potentially start seeing effects for like through southern Florida all the way through the
Okay, so a question is, what is the timing of all this, especially for southern Florida, and then, of course, as it makes it through southern Florida and then for us? So as of right now, the National Hurricane Center, again, this is called the cone of uncertainty because ideally, we really have no idea what direction it's going to take. So at this point right now, by Saturday morning at 8 a.m., this could be affecting the periphery of the southern peninsula of Florida. So Miami, Key Largo, Key West. By the time we get into Sunday morning at 8 a.m., the trajectory can be anywhere from the Keys to Miami to, say, Orlando, and then off the East Coast to Juniper, Florida. On the West Coast, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Fort Myers. Or it could dip even further south and mostly affecting Cuba. So the timing for the United States is pretty much going to be as early as Saturday morning at 8 a.m. to as late as Sunday morning at 8 a.m. And keep in mind that this is going to be changing a lot over the next 4 or 5 days. But at least at right now, whether it's Saturday morning or Sunday morning, we're looking at anywhere between a Category 4 hurricane of 145 to 150 mile an hour winds. And the most devastating part of a hurricane is the northern and eastern quadrants of a hurricane. So that's for Florida. That's for the 5-day track officially from the National Hurricane Center. From after 5 days, there's still uncertainty of what's going to happen. All models indicate that it will turn to the north. Whether it turns to the north when it's north of Cuba, in the Florida Keys, in Nassau, the Bahamas, or in Miami. It's going to turn to the north at some point. Is it going to stay on the West Coast? Is it going to stay on the East Coast? The bottom line is that this will definitely affect Florida. And this will affect Florida as far out as Panama City, to Tallahassee, Jacksonville, Tampa, St. Pete, Fort Myers, Miami, the Juniper Inlet, Daytona Beach, Jacksonville, and then eventually into portions of Georgia and South Carolina. Is this going to happen the next 6-7 days? We're not sure. But the models are tending to tell us that on the 6th and 7th day, it'll be transecting northward through Florida, whether it's on each side, and then eventually impacting the Midlands and South Carolina as early as Monday to as late as Tuesday.
Basically, it looks like we may want to recap. A lot of people are asking about the intensity again, the current vital conditions, so we may have to do a little recap here.
Okay, so let's recap on what we have right now. The National Hurricane Center updated this at about an hour ago. Hurricane Irma is still a Category 5, but its intensity has gone up. Currently, the winds are at 180 miles an hour, gusting to 220. This is an absolutely ferocious hurricane. Symmetrically, it is absolutely perfectly round, and the eye wall is very, very distinct. Now, looking back at Hurricane Harvey, when it was a Category 4 hurricane, when it made landfall in Texas, the eye wall was very pronounced, but it was about 10 miles wide. This one right now is about 30 miles wide. Hurricane warnings are already in effect for the British Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, as is expected over the course of the next 36 hours to maintain as a very strong Category 5 hurricane. By Wednesday morning at 8 a.m., 175 mile an hour winds. By Thursday, 8 a.m., 160 mile an hour winds. By Friday, it's going to be positioning itself in the lower islands of the Greater Antilles and eastern Cuba, north of Haiti, with 155 mile an hour winds as a very strong Category 4 hurricane. By Saturday, it can be positioned anywhere from Nassau and Freeport, the Bahamas, to just northern coastline of central Cuba to the southern coastline of Cuba. By Sunday, it positions itself anywhere from the western peninsula of Cuba to the Florida Keys to Miami to possibly in the northern part of the Greater Antilles over by Freeport. That's by Sunday morning. It looks like an intensity at this point Sunday morning as high as 145 mile an hour winds. So this is the current track from the National Hurricane Center. I suspect that we will have another update, an intermediate update between 1 and 2 o'clock our time later today before they put another update out between 4:30 and 5. So this is ever changing. But the bottom line is that for us, we're going to be watching this very carefully. There is no timetable right now for certain for South Carolina, but all indications right now that we'll start feeling the effects. At least the rain will start as early as Monday morning. Now, we're about to come on for the 12 o'clock newscast in about 17 minutes. I'll have an update on this as well. And any other questions you have, especially if you're seeing this after we've gone live, you can definitely post the questions over there on our Facebook page because we're going to be continuing this for the next several days. Until then, everyone, stay safe out there and watch very carefully as we continue to track Hurricane Irma.